Okay, so it finally happened. After all these months of previews, sponsored videos, and everything else, we finally have full production samples of Qualcomm's Snapdragon X2 Elite, their next generation CPU for the Windows on ARM ecosystem. And look, the gloves are coming off here because we are going to put these things through a ton of tests, A to Z. We're going to put them under the microscope to see if all these claims that have been made actually pan out into good devices and good CPUs. It's going to be interesting because a few months ago we published a complete overview of these where we ran some benchmarks on pre-production systems. So how close were those early numbers to actual retail systems? Well, to find out, we have three Asus Zenbook laptops here, each with a different X2E processor. There's two A16s with the X2 Elite Extreme series, basically Qualcomm's flagship CPUs, while the A14 has a standard X2 Elite CPU. Oh, and by the way, this video is in no way, shape, or form sponsored by either Asus or Qualcomm. And even these laptops, we're gonna have to send them back when all of the testing is done. But I think at this point, a little bit, I guess, of a refresher is probably in order here because Qualcomm's new lineup is pretty confusing. It includes like a ton of new CPUs that are all very similar, but in some key ways, they're also different from one another too. Basically, the X2E 96 and 94 sit right at the top, with the only difference between them being the 96's 300 megahertz higher boost frequency in single and dual core workloads. Then there's three standard X2 Elites with the 90 and 88 essentially being clones of the 96 and 94 respectively, but they get detuned multi-core and GPU speeds. Memory is another thing that separates these two series. While the Extreme CPUs rock a massive triple controller 192-bit interface with huge bandwidth numbers, the X2 Elites get a standard dual controller setup. Meanwhile, further down the lineup, you'll find 12-core parts that'll make it into less expensive laptops, but only later this year. All of those are copy and pastes of one another, other than some very, very minor speed variations in their boost frequencies. So what we have here is what I feel is a really good cross-section of three CPUs in three very, very similar systems. Now, what we have to do though is also set the stage in a way by talking about all of the competition that we're going to be showing in this video and how they align for things like power and screens. Basically, what we're trying to do here is normalize power across all the platforms for real apples to apples comparison. So every laptop is set to about 30 watts of CPU power, which is a typical power envelope for thin and light laptops. We're also adding the results we initially got with our pre-production device, with its beta drivers and early firmware, to see if there's been any progression between a few months ago and now with these mass production models. Okay, so that sets the stage, right? But what is the first thing that anybody wants to know about when buying a laptop like this? So like a thin and light device. And that is the portability factor. What kind of battery life are you going to get with these new processors? And let's start off with a new test. We've developed a custom script that runs laptops through a typical day of usage. So attending online meetings over a webcam, setting up spreadsheets, editing office documents, sending emails, browsing the web, chatting on Discord, listening to Spotify, and watching a few YouTube videos. It's a pretty mixed overall bag. And here at least, the Snapdragons are way, way far ahead, at least against the other Windows-based devices. The two A16s get about 2 hours more battery life than Panther Lake models. The X1E is even further behind, proving there's been some serious gen-to-gen efficiency improvements here too. Meanwhile, the smaller A14 with its X2E 88 chip is miles, and I mean miles ahead of everything else except the MacBook Pro. Moving on to our standard web browsing test, and the situation sort of flips on its head. While the X2E 88 in the 14-inch Zenbook is still an absolute monster here, the other X2E systems now fall behind Panther Lake while staying ahead of Lunar Lake. And that's still a nice bump over the first gen architecture, but a little bit behind Intel's latest and greatest. On the other hand, the MacBook Pro's battery life is literally impossible to beat when streaming online video. And yet its numbers need to be taken with a little bit of context here, because it's the only laptop we tested with a mini LED screen, which is technically a bit more power hungry than the OLEDs on every other device here. Anyways, the Snapdragons stay ahead of other Windows laptop CPUs, and the X2E 88 takes a commanding lead over the two A16s. It also shows vast improvements over the pre-production laptop we tested months ago. And that proves why we needed to avoid its battery life results in our preview video. They were good, but the final numbers on the A14 are just spectacular. The two Extreme series processors are also pretty good here, but they basically match the previous generation X1E rather than beating it outright. Personally, I think this is simply their bigger screens eating up more juice than the 14-inch Slim 7X. As for gaming, this has more to do with how much power is being pushed towards the integrated graphics rather than overall efficiency, and typically larger battery capacities tend to win out here. But what's evident is Qualcomm's pushing a lot of juice to the IGP when these things are unplugged. Yes, that will lead to better performance, but it just crushes battery life. Also, the pre-production device just destroyed everything else because its early firmware actually throttled down power, so it was able to stay on a lot longer. So at least on the surface of things, those numbers make the X2 Elite series seem like the battery life champion, right? They are head and shoulders above everything else, at least in the Windows laptop space. But what we're showing here is sort of like the tip of the iceberg, right? Because while we tried to normalize for battery capacity, it turns out that some of these laptops had slightly bigger batteries, or some of them had actually slightly smaller batteries. That means we need another metric to show how good or bad these laptops are when away from the mains. So let's have a real apples to apples efficiency comparison here by calculating how many minutes of battery life each laptop got per watt hour of capacity. So it turns out the MacBook is still the champ here. It's just amazing, but not by all that much when compared to the X288. Meanwhile, all the Snapdragon CPUs were ahead of x86 processors regardless of their screen size. And there's one other thing here that should be pretty evident. That's AMD's laptop CPU lineup needs like a complete update. With the 400 series only being a slight refresh of their 300 series, Ryzen's are just treading water here, while everything else, especially Qualcomm, just surges ahead. And another thing we need to take into account is there's only 3 16-inch devices here, the two A16s and the VivoBook S16 attached to the HX370. Meanwhile, the X9 388H is in a Zenbook Duo that's pretty inefficient, and that means the XPS does show the best that Panther Lake can be when paired up with a 14-inch OLED. Then again, that actually makes the new Snapdragon results even more impressive. I mean, look at this. The A16s are getting about the same efficiency as the previous generation did on a 14-inch device, while the A14 is, again, so far ahead. As a matter of fact, the X288 actually beats the M5 here by a pretty big margin, and that's huge news for any, and I mean any, Windows device. So in a true apples-to-apples comparison, it turns out that these new Qualcomm processors are actually exactly what people wanted of the Windows on ARM ecosystem. They are hyper efficient. They are the battery life champs. They can even put the screws to Apple in a lot of cases. But can Qualcomm actually carry through with good performance? Well, the first thing I absolutely need to talk about here is application compatibility. It'll be everyone's biggest concern heading into the Windows on ARM experience. And I've got to say, it's improved by leaps and bounds since the first generation processors were launched more than a year ago. Back when we first tested the X1E series, some apps didn't run, others were missing some key features, and sometimes performance was just terrible, since programs ended up running through this horribly clunky emulation layer rather than natively. And the list, it went on and on. But did things change? I would say absolutely, because while that first experience that we had with Windows on ARM and the X1E series was so frustrating for everybody here that was doing the testing, benchmarking, and everything else, now the vast majority of programs that we use here at the office run natively without any trouble whatsoever. And then there's also still a few, yes, that run through an emulation layer, but it's a lot more efficient than it used to be. Like in Blender, we use the Cycles engine to do our GPU accelerated rendering test, and currently there's no support for the Adreno GPU, but it should be rolled out later this year, and support has already been pushed into the Eevee renderer. But of the 3 dozen or maybe even more applications that we use here at the office, both for benchmarking and monitoring and a bunch of other things, not one of them had any problems. The only red flag that was raised by the team here was that Blender one. Everything else perfectly fine. Multi-core Cinebench testing has always been a strong area for Snapdragon processors, but these are like a quantum leap over the previous generation. That's largely due to architectural changes and the fact that the X2E series has more processing cores than the X1E 78 we're showing here. Still, they're also head and shoulders above the M5 too. And yet in single core testing, the Mac, it just reigns supreme. It isn't even close. Still though, all of these new CPUs end up being significantly better than the X Elite and even Intel's Panther Lake models. And those multi-core advantages we saw in Cinebench translate directly into X2E domination in real-life workloads too. These things are on a whole other level when compared to other CPUs we typically find in thin and light laptops. Something else I should bring up is how the pre-launch device is a bit ahead of the production models here. That's mostly because it has an input power advantage. On average, it was fed with a little bit more power, allowing for slightly higher frequencies in all core workloads. Moving on to mixed use cases, and Qualcomm's numbers are still really good, but they don't outright dominate every other platform like they did in the multi-core tests. AMD gets pretty close, but in Lightroom, Apple's hugely optimized ecosystem gives them a commanding lead. The same goes for Photoshop. Apple's untouchable, but every one of the X2 Elite processors give you substantially better performance than anything else on the Windows side. I mean, the original X1 series was competitive here, but these new chips just bring it to a whole other level. But once we move on to GPU accelerated workloads, well, Qualcomm's lead pretty much evaporates. I mean, yes, the updates done to the new Adreno core do give it like a doubling of performance versus the last generation, and that allows it to stay ahead of the 288V and even tie the Ultra X7. And I'm sure Qualcomm, they'll be maybe the first to admit this. There's obviously still some work to be done on the optimization front, at least in NLEs like Premiere Pro. On the positive side, Snapdragon CPUs have gone from just terrible to pretty competitive here, but they're still beaten by Apple's latest silicon and even Panther Lake. Resolve falls into that category too. Apple is just untouchable, but they got to that point through Blackmagic's software side optimizations coupled with Apple's hardware and ecosystem. So technically, this is something Qualcomm could do too. So I'm really hoping these numbers improve as time goes on. And I think everybody knows what comes next, and that's gaming. And look, I know what you're thinking in the back of your head. This is going to be an absolute shit show, a horror story, me screaming at you guys that nothing works. But I can't say that. I was actually pleasantly surprised, I guess, by how things turned out, because the last time we tried to test these, or at least the previous generation processors, when the platform first launched like a year and a half ago, I was screaming at the screen, frantically Googling for ways to make a bunch of games work, and most of them, especially ones with anti-cheat built in, well, they simply didn't. And now things have improved, I would say, drastically. They aren't perfect yet, but it just feels like we're getting there. Because this time, of the dozen games that we tried, only 3 didn't work. Compare that to the 50% or more that were incompatible about a year ago, and yeah, it feels like Qualcomm, they're actually making some bona fide progress here. So what did go wrong? Well, PUBG's anti-cheat prevents you from loading the game. It's still like this, it hasn't changed. The same thing goes for Arc Raiders, which is actually too bad considering how easy it is to run on even the most basic hardware. Battlefield 6, on the other hand, that's a big one. It specifically calls out the platform as being incompatible. I mean, sure, we could say the same about the Apple ecosystem. As a matter of fact, even less games work natively on their platform than on Windows on ARM, but at least there's some ways around it. You can use third-party software like Crossover, which introduces a Windows compatibility layer for macOS that allows you to run games and apps which aren't compatible with Apple's ecosystem. And right now, Windows on ARM simply doesn't have anything like that. There is no third-party ecosystem that's actively working on these compatibility issues. So basically, if Qualcomm, Microsoft, the developers, or I guess like all 3, don't make it work, it's not going to work. Anyways, what you're going to see in gaming is a mixed bag for Qualcomm, but it has been improving. When everything from like software to game optimization aligns just right, the X2 Elite series hits frame rates that place them somewhere between the 288V, HX370, and Ultra X7 series. That's pretty good for a relative newcomer to the integrated graphics game. It also shows absolutely incredible improvements over the previous generation that, in my opinion at least, was a complete write-off for most things gaming related. There's also very little performance difference between the mid-level X2E 88 and the big boy Extreme series chips, which is likely because they all share what's essentially the same GPU core layout. But yes, there's absolutely still areas where the Adreno GPU needs better driver optimizations, because we know it can be competitive against some of the best IGPs out there. And yet there are situations like these where the game will boot up, but performance is far less than what other platforms will give you. In many cases, you can get playable frame rates overall, but there's a huge variation between averages and 1% lows, which leads to very, very inconsistent on-screen motion. So in many ways, it just feels like the best is yet to come for Qualcomm Snapdragon series and gaming. And yes, I just feel like I sound like a broken record when I say that, but I do think that I have a leg to stand on here, because they have shown a willingness to get things working, to get things to a level where gaming on these processors isn't just an impossibility, it's actually possible in a lot of situations and at relatively playable frame rates too. But anyways, I think the next stop in this sort of grand tour of ours of these new CPUs is how well they perform on battery power. And the answer to that is pretty good actually, but that's to be expected because we saw in the battery life numbers when the system is under heavy load, Qualcomm's sacrificing battery life to give you better performance. Meanwhile, the Apple M5 doesn't need to go quite so extreme, since its lower power envelope natively gives you a better combination of raw horsepower and battery savings. And I have to say, straight up, no word of a lie, straight from my heart, what Qualcomm has accomplished with the Snapdragon X2 Elite series is it's something special, because the laptop space for the last years and years and years, we've been used to like these incremental upgrades, these little nuggets that are thrown by CPU manufacturers. But the X2 Elite series, it represents like a quantum leap forward from where the X1 series was. Instead of the usual 10, 15, or even like 30% uplift, we're seeing an almost doubling of performance right across the board. And that leads to better overall numbers than anything, and I mean anything else, in the thin and light Windows laptop space. Snapdragon is the undisputed champ here, and it can even put the screws to Apple's M5 in a bunch of situations too. And that's also backed up by some just like titanic battery life numbers. And yes, I'll be the first to admit it, and you guys saw it too. The GPU side of this equation, it does need, I guess, a little bit of massaging, a little bit more time to bake in the oven until you feel like it's ready. But for like 95% of users out there, the Snapdragon series has basically gone from just barely good enough to like class leading in every way. And yet with all of that positivity and the massive strides this ecosystem has taken on the compatibility side, it might take a hell of a lot more than that to change what people think of Windows on ARM. Instead of a lean, no-nonsense OS, a rival to Mac OS, it launched in a sorry state, and as this like weird vehicle for an AI platform that people didn't and still don't want. And even today, that's still the narrative. And yes, there's still some nagging questions hanging on about future game compatibility and even Linux support. Because let's be honest here, with these numbers, a Snapdragon laptop would make an almost unbelievably good Linux machine. And unfortunately, Qualcomm seems to have little to no interest in pursuing that angle. Personally, I think that's a huge mistake. And other than platform compatibility issues and the hate for all things Copilot that's still ongoing, those first generation Snapdragon X1E laptops, they had one major thing going against them, and that was price. Because Microsoft thought that this unique computing experience that they were going to give you warranted a premium dollar value on the first generation devices. And boy, oh boy, did they come to a reckoning about that, because all of those things quickly went on like fire sale. But luckily, we're seeing some, I guess you would say, glimmers of hope on that front too. Like the Asus Zenbook A14 we tested here with its X2E 88 CPU, OLED screen, 24 gigs of memory, and a 512 gig SSD is supposed to go for under $1,200 at Best Buy in the US. And considering what you're getting, I think that's like an absolute phenomenal value in 2026. It'll probably go for even less than that on one of Best Buy's continual sales. And that's to the point where it makes the 16-inch mid-range models look positively and completely overpriced by comparison. So the biggest question here remains is, can that narrative of Windows on ARM be shifted in some way by all the positive aspects of these new CPUs? Personally, I really hope so, because in 2026, we need all of the competition that we can get to keep prices at least at a sort of fair level. Or maybe all the damage has already been done and it's like an irreparable situation for Windows on ARM. And look, I want to know from you guys, do you see this as now being a bona fide competitor, or are all of those lingering questions about Windows on ARM, compatibility, and that sort of like sour taste in a lot of people's mouths from a year and a half ago, is that still lingering on? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.